Okay, it's my last week before Parliament is suspended for a week, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about lawmaking and weird alliances. Inside the Lords this week has actually been fascinating and a real learning experience. Just on lawmaking, I started off the week talking about natural habitats, and you might have wondered what I was going on about. But it's worth bearing in mind that when we left the European Union, in fact before we actually formally left with the agreement, we had to domesticate every single piece of legislation and regulation that had been passed in the EU. That was a sensible thing to do. You bring it into to UK law, and then democratically we have a chance to review every single piece of legislation and regulation and say whether we want to be in it, because we've moaned for long enough that the EU forced us to accept them. But actually, there is no appetite at the heart of government to review hardly any of the EU regulations. I mean, let's be honest, the British ruling class wrote most of them. They just did it without democratic accountability. So there was a question on the EU Habitat Directive, and this is one of those issues. It's just been brought into UK law, and the question was, can we review this? Because the Habitat Directive is an incredibly cumbersome precautionary principle that's used to protect wildlife habitat. What that actually means in reality is, if you want to build a factory or a road or a home, you have to go through huge numbers of hoops to make sure that you're not disturbing local wildlife, birds, insects, newts, as I mentioned in the speech. And this is not me saying, oh, who gives a damn about wildlife? But actually, it's far too expensive to have to do that if you're going to build. And there's much better ways of saying, let's have a look at not destroying every bit of natural world than following this EU habitat. But Zach Goldsmith made it absolutely clear that he loved the EU Habitat Directive, and in fact, they're not going to do anything about it. But it shows you that lawmaking isn't as simple as you think, that we haven't actually got to a point where we're actually really shaking up the onerous EU regulations, burning the red tape, as it were. No, we've just brought it home and nobody even knows it's going on. So it's something I'm going to keep my eye on in the future. Second thing about lawmaking is that there was an interesting debate about law in Northern Ireland in relation to abortion. Now, this is an extraordinary story because I absolutely support the right for abortion on demand for women, and I want to decriminalise even more than the 1967 Act does now. But I know it's a controversial issue, and I know that a lot of you watching won't agree with me. A lot of my followers certainly don't, and made that clear. In other words, I know it's an argument, right? It's an argument that you have to have. Now, in Northern Ireland, as you all know, the Northern Irish Assembly was absolutely suspended for ages. And during that time, that was terrible for the women of Northern Ireland because they didn't have any services, I mean, in general. And what was definitely suspended was abortion services. Nobody commissioned them. And so it seems appropriate then that the UK government would step in and start commissioning services. But they did it in a really peculiar way. And they introduced very liberal abortion services, far more liberal than here, for the women of Northern Ireland. But since then, the Northern Irish Assembly has reconvened, and the Northern Irish Assembly refuses to accept that imposition. So the law is now being pushed through this place in the House of Lords and in the House of Commons to say they're going to ignore the Northern Irish Assembly. And it doesn't matter what you think about this. The truth is, I am bored rigid of people telling me how important devolution is when it comes to Wales and Scotland. I'm also about to go into a debate with Lord Frost about the Northern Irish protocol, in which all of the Remainers, everybody will say the most important thing is a Good Friday Agreement and Northern Irish devolution and consent in the context of the Northern Irish Assembly. But when it came to this issue of abortion, everybody just said, oh, forget about that. It's okay for the Northern Irish Secretary of State to override any democratic accountability whatsoever and to impose abortion laws. Now, there might be abortion regulations that I like, but that's not the point. It seems to me to be an abuse of the law. It's also the case that they left it right till the last minute. They left it to the end of this parliamentary session, and they actually passed it through the Commons just as Easter recess was about to happen. So they didn't want a debate, and it was annoying because the feminist-leaning, pro-women's rights people in the room didn't even bother putting themselves down to speak. They were happy to just vote it through. They jeered all of the Northern Irish unionists who were anti-abortion, many of them, and they kind of just wanted it to go through without a debate. And that is, in my view, not the way you win any argument anywhere. It's anti-democratic. But on weird alliances, it did feel peculiar to me to be voting with a lot of people from the anti-abortion Northern Irish unionists and Catholic, ironically. That was one thing that united them, camps. So, there's been a few odd alliances. I've joined up in an alliance with Bishops this week as well. Bishops and the Lib Dems and the Labour Party to oppose the imposition of the Fire Safety Act, which would have dire implications for leaseholders. Now, I've spoken on this so much, I'm not going to bore you with telling the whole story again. But one thing that you need to know is that the Fire Safety Bill was rushed through last night. I had to stay late. It ping-ponged, which I explained last week, from the House of Commons. They kept rejecting the amendment, back to the Lords, then it went back to the Commons, then back to the Lords. And eventually last night the Lords gave in, or rather, let's put it this way, the Labour Party gave in and decided to not vote for their own amendment, and so in the end the government won. Leaseholders feel betrayed. But one of the reasons to do that is because it's the end of the parliamentary session, and if the Labour Party had insisted on going, that basically the Fire Safety Bill would have fallen, and that was what was of concern. In my view, the Fire Safety Bill is so limited that it could have easily been brought back. But if a bill, nobody was going to be unsafe because of that bill going, and if it didn't go through. But the Fire Safety Bill, nonetheless, the Labour Party didn't want that, and their conscience, so they gave in. So then you think, well, God, we're really being forced to do this because the government kept saying, if you don't agree to this, you're going to be back here. We're going to stay till the middle of the night. It's going to ping pong all night. You've got to pass this. And as I say, eventually the Labour Party gave in. But it's interesting because I then thought, the end of a parliamentary session, and if bills aren't passed, then they don't come back for a year or so, right? It's quite a long time, so it's a real threat over you. And this time last week, I thought they couldn't possibly prorogue today, they couldn't possibly end Parliament, because there was so much legislation hanging around. But actually, they've just forced things through, absolutely, the threat. Wiser minds than me said, no, they'll prorogue on Thursday, Claire, it doesn't matter. No, it's never happened that they don't do it. So I think that then there's a date in which an end of session ends. And I think, this must be convention. So I asked someone, said, no, completely arbitrary. Right, so there's no need. It could have been next month. Right, there was absolutely no reason whatsoever, other than a date plucked out of some time, that this session, some sessions go on for years. I mean, historically. In other words, it is a way of forcing through legislation and kind of starting again with a new legislative period. But it did make me think how unfair it was that certain laws were forced through with no scrutiny, no debate, simply because of an arbitrary end of session rule. But on the other hand, the good thing about that kind of very intense work on the Fire Safety Bill at the end was that I think there were alliances formed there, because I'm not even having a go at the Labour Party on this one. The Labour Party, the Lib Dems, the Tories who supported the amendments supporting the leaseholders, and the Bishops, I think there will be a campaign now that will really fight for the leaseholders, because I don't care what anyone says, the fuss over Boris Johnson and his wallpaper and the interior of his flat, that so-called scandal, to me feels like a confected one. I mean, he may well have behaved dishonourably. This is of no great surprise, to be honest. But what is really dishonourable is that Boris Johnson promised absolutely that the leaseholders would not have to pay for the remediation works on their flats. And he said that only in February this year, and they are going to have to pay. There is no arrangements being made. That is a far greater scandal when it comes to housing than anything that's happened in terms of what couch he bought from John Lewis or not. So anyway, that's that one. The Parliament is now, I'm going to go in there now. There's a question on vaccination passports, which I wasn't selected for, which is a shame. But I'm really going in today because it's the first time that I will have sat through the prorogation ceremony, and apparently it's in Latin and people dress up and do all that, so I'm kind of, in that kind of like a tourist, fascinated to watch it and see what happens. And then we're actually off for a week, and so Parliament won't resume again until the Queen's speech, which is a week on Tuesday. The Queen's speech is where all of the new legislation will be announced, I obviously won't be there at the ceremony or anything. I wasn't selected for that. But that is where I'll have my work cut out, because if you look at the kind of things the government are talking about, it's going to be bans on protests, the online harms bill, which is going to be very damaging to free speech, all sorts of pieces of legislation that I hope that I will, have some impact on, certainly have certain things to say on. Just on the online harms bill, that's one of the things which I actually had a little bit of a funny experience this week, which was that I was walking along outside the Lords, and a bunch of those Remainers, well-known people, started shouting and harassing me, and then they filmed it and they put it on Twitter, and it was creepy, to being filmed, then it put on Twitter, and then hundreds of them sort of FBPE people commented on it. Let me tell you, it's unpleasant, and you feel like you're being a bit stalked, right? And then people said to me, well, so much for free speech. Well, I just want to note, I don't want that man to be arrested if he shouts at me. I don't care whether they put it online. It was unpleasant, but I survived it. I've got so many trolls. There's one called Miffy Buckley in particular, who's been driving me mad, who sets his trolls on me all the time. These people are really obnoxious. Do I think that we need a piece of legislation to shut them up or arrest them? Absolutely not. I'm a public figure. I have to take it, and we have to get used to it. And that is far more damaging if they bring in a law that actually gives authority to either the state or the big tech companies to actually criminalise speech. So just to make it clear, I don't like it. I have to put up with it. That's the deal. What's going to have happened before I see you next, though, is although everyone's looking for... I know that they're all planning their holidays in there. I'm not having a holiday. I am going to be doing interesting political work, I hope. First of all, next time I speak, there will have been a local election, and I really hope that people think about voting beyond the mainstream political parties. Don't not vote if possible. I mean, even though I've actually, on the Weird Alliances, I'm not recommending people go in any direction, but I did a little film this week with somebody who's standing at Bermondsey Binman, John Cronin, who's standing for Reform UK. I met up with the SDP candidate Steve Kellner, and who's standing for Mayor for the SDP. On Saturday I'm going to meet Bolton for Change, and also Nick Buckley standing for Reform UK in Manchester. I'm not really supporting them. I'm interested in the fact that Laurence Fox is standing for Reclaim, pros and cons and all the rest of it. But these kind of micro parties, the fact that there's independents like Neil Crowley and Martin Perks, who are standing as independents, standing against things like the low traffic neighbourhoods, making a fuss about local democracy, that seems to me to matter. And I do think you should check out some of those alternative candidates. I'm certainly going to do that. The other thing is that we're going to actually, and this is exciting, start inviting all the speakers for our Battle of Ideas Festival at Buckingham on the 17th of October. And and then putting up the sessions... Oh, sorry, I've just said the wrong month. The 17th of July, which is very soon. So we're going to have our speakers sorted. There will be a website full of the content, and you can start buying your tickets. So we're doing that. It's one of the things I'm going to be doing next week. And we're also going to start the plans for our October Battle of Ideas, which is on the 10th of October for your diary. But we're also carrying on with our Zoom events. We've got a book club tonight on... We've got a book club tonight on Kazuo Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun. I can't tell you how wonderful this book is. It's well worth a read, and I don't know whether I'll get back in time because I'll be travelling, but I absolutely love this book, so check it out on the Academy of Ideas Twitter feed, Facebook and website. Next Thursday, I'm doing an In Conversation with Luke Gittos on his book, which is critical of human rights law. And I've noticed more and more people saying that we should call on human rights law to defend ourselves against vaccine passports, or defend our rights. I think I disagree, but it'll be an interesting discussion. Do come along, and I will catch up with you when I'm back in the Lords.